Okay, so I'm talking about the Global Harmonization Initiative, and this is all about making sure that our food is safe and authentic, but also affordable. We all know that food has to correspond to what it says in the tin, and it's not allowed to contain any banned substances. If that's not the case, then the food will be considered either adulterated or contaminated. And if that happens, the food is considered either fraudulent in the first case or unsafe in the second case, or of course both can happen at the same time. And if something like that is discovered, then the normal procedure is that the food which has these illegal constituents is usually confiscated and destroyed by the authorities. I'll just give you some examples of the kind of problems that I'm talking about. So on this slide here, you see some examples of various food incidents, putting lead into paprika to give it a better color, or melamine into milk powder to increase the nitrogen value so you could dilute it with milk without being found out. Diethylene glycol in wine, or using transformer oil for French fries because it's cheaper. All these cases are where people intentionally, fraudulently put stuff into food that shouldn't have been there, so basically criminal offenses. But of course, food might also contain illegal constituents without any intention or fraud involved. This case here, I put it up because it was very serious, with something like at least 50 people dying, but it was definitely not intentional. The brewers in Manchester, they developed this fantastic new method using sulfuric acid to hydrolyze sugar and make cheaper beer, but they were not aware that the cheap sulfuric acid contained arsenic. So for years, the people going to the cheap pubs suffered from what the doctors thought that was some new type of alcoholism, because they had other symptoms that normal for alcoholics. And so it took quite a long time before anybody realized that there was something wrong with the beer. And when it was discovered, for the next couple of years, the consumption of officially sold beer in the UK actually fell to about 1/3. It's many years ago, but it's still sort of behind much of the legislation we have today. Acrylamide, you know the story about that. I'll mention it again. DDT for many years was seen as the solution to all problems. So this was actually a advertisement that was back from the 40s, but we're still suffering from the problems. We still have some people eat lots of fish, they have problem with DDT even nowadays. And then of course things which are not necessarily safety in the sense of anybody getting killed, but still about food problems with food quality, where, for example, organic farmers have problems that if the neighbor is growing GM crops, then the organic food is not organic anymore, even though the organic farmer has done nothing wrong. So we have all these cases where unintentionally food ends up not meeting the specifications in terms of safety and authenticity. In some cases, either legally or intentionally or not, that you have illegal constituents, it's clear that there's a health risk for the consumer. And of course, if there's a health risk, it's correct that the food should be taken out of the food chain. But in many cases, even though the food does not meet the legal specifications, there's actually no risk to the consumer. There's not a health risk. And in that case, destruction of the food is actually an unjustifiable waste of food as well as money. So what the Global Harmonization Initiative is all about is to advocate that we should use science rather than feelings, and I'll come back to later what I mean by that, to define what is actually an appropriate distinction between safe and unsafe food. And then we should harmonize the national regulations. That's why it's called the Harmonization Initiative. and prevent unnecessary waste of safe food. So this sounds very idealistic, but I'll try to explain in this presentation what I actually mean by it and how we hope to do it. Firstly, I'll say a few things about unwanted constituents in food, and it's mostly about pesticides and pesticide residue, because this is the area where there is the largest number of cases where people are worried about whether food is safe or not. But of course, I'm just using those as examples, and much of what I'm saying would be relevant for any other kind of illegal or unintentional but potentially toxic compound in the food. If we're talking about specific compounds that we don't want in the food, we will often find out that they are not necessarily added. They could be in the food naturally. They could be produced by animals, microbes, plants themselves, or even you have sulfur dioxide coming out of volcanoes. For example, many pesticides are chlorinated organic compounds, and until a few years ago, it was commonly assumed that if you found a chlorinated organic compound in a food, that must show that it has been contaminated with a synthetic pesticide. But actually, when we investigate plants more carefully, it turns out that lots of plants are able to make their own chlorinated organic compounds, which then, of course, might change again during processing of the product. And so there are thousands of different compounds that on a quick glance look like synthetic pesticides, but they actually are perfectly normal constituents of the plants. Here's an example of a pesticide which is a synthetic pesticide, which is allowed to be used in some countries, but not in other countries. The reason for the difference in regulation is because there's a different view about the effect on the environment. But in those countries where they're not allowed to use it, they then have a very low level of what is allowed to be in the food. You could think that it was because they thought that it would be a health risk to the consumer, but actually, when you ask the people who are doing the regulation, they say, no, it's not really. At those levels, it would not really be dangerous for the consumer. So you just wonder why they have this regulation, which makes it difficult to import food from other countries and makes it easier for the local producers to sell their own food in that country. But they do not even pretend that it's about consumer safety. They just say this is our regulation in this case. Another aspect which is confusing for a lot of people, and there's been some talk about organic food here today and previous days, we have to keep in mind that if we're just thinking about pesticides in the sense of potentially toxic compounds, there's definitely more pesticides in organic food than in conventional food. Of course, these are natural pesticides. They are not synthetic pesticides. But the plants make their own pesticides, and that's why they don't get sick. If there wasn't a lot of pesticides in organic plants, they would get all kinds of diseases. They don't actually get all kinds of diseases, which is why, to the surprise of many conventional scientists, organic crops tend to have quite reasonable yields. But they're still pesticides. And of course, also, and here I'm not playing on the words, but most pesticides are actually organic compounds, of course, in the chemical sense, that they are based on the same type of carbon skeletons as the natural pesticide made by plants. And in some cases, the compounds are very, very similar. Of course, this is nothing new for scientists. We know that the similar compounds have a similar effect on our bodies. But when you look at the regulations, you get an impression that they are completely different and have completely different effects on our bodies. Here's just some examples of various types of compounds which we know can be toxic if you get very high concentrations, and which are found naturally in common vegetables, and there are many, many others. You might think that I'm trying to tell you that these vegetables are bad for you for this reason. I'm not. On the opposite, I know perfectly well that these vegetables are very healthy, and I personally think it is because they contain these compounds, but I'll come back to later why. If we also take a compound or a substance like coffee, which you might just have had a cup of, and maybe I should have had this presentation before coffee break. Here's just a list of some of the toxic compounds found in coffee. All of these compounds have a health warning if you buy them from Sigma for using your experiment, because they are toxic and most of them are carcinogenic. But they occur, it's impossible to make coffee without these compounds in them. Either they come from the plant themselves or they occur during the processing. However, the big problem with the regulations it's not so much the fact that we have regulations. We think that's a good thing, but the problem is if we have difference in regulations. So one country has one set of rules and regulations, and another country has a different set of rules and regulations. And you almost feel like the customs officers are sitting there at the border, can we get something here that we can destroy so that our competitors will lose money? So on one hand, a lot of food is being destroyed, and this is in a world where there are also people who are starving. And on the other hand, clearly these differences in regulation are a big hamper on the international trade and innovation. Because if you invent some new food, then you have to get all the other countries to allow it. It's not enough just where you start out. Now, for food safety regulations, if they were all based on good quality science, then of course they would all be the same, presumably, because we have the idea of the scientific method, which means that in principle, scientists should all work from the same data. And of course we can discuss the details, but we should generally be able to agree. However, food safety regulations are generally not made by scientists. There's politicians, there's sort of the general public, there's various types of activists, there's the press, the lobbyists. Maybe particularly the lobbyists are very important for shaping the food safety regulations. But we also have the press having big effects. Here's just an example of something written in a newspaper about the acrylamide, and notice here it says scientists have identified high levels of acrylamide. Well, how do you define high levels of acrylamide? Certainly it would be a lot lower than the levels that anybody has ever seen actually having cancer effects yet, at least what I've seen in normal food. Of course now the rules have changed, so we have lower levels, but they're not that much lower. So you have this problem of the press and people with no scientific background influencing the regulations for whatever reasons they might have for it, including selling newspapers, which is not a very important scientific activity. And we end up with some regulations which are completely absurd. Here's some examples. One of them is about where we have, for example, zero tolerance for antibiotics in food. And we can sort of calculate that a poor little baby trying to eat baby food that exceeds the regulations would have to eat 20,000 kilos a day to get so much that it might be dangerous for them. Or for example, the Sudan Red scandal. We're looking at the amounts there. You would have to drink 800 liters per day of the most strongly contaminated food to have a chance of actually seeing a benefit, and not just for one day, but for the whole life. And so those are some examples where the consequences of regulation is completely absurd, where you take one rule, combine it with another rule, and you end up with something which is completely silly. Another example is where what happened in the Netherlands quite recently, where a feed company, and there was fraud involved, but feed came out to some animal breeders where there was an illegal amount of antibiotics in it. And what happened was that the authorities confiscated all those calves and destroyed them, and hundreds of farmers went bust without having done anything wrong themselves, and where the concentrations in that meat again were so high that you would have to eat huge amounts during a lifetime to ever have any risk for you. And actually this particular antibiotic, because of course it's used to treat people, so we actually know that we can give it in doses which are so much higher without having any negative effects in cases where we want to. Of course, the reasons why we don't want antibiotics in the meat is because we don't want the farmers to exploit antibiotics in a way so that the bacteria become resistant. That's a very sensible rule. It is completely correct to have the restrictions to make it illegal for the farmers to use antibiotics, and it's also perfectly fine to use our detection abilities in order to find out when it's there where it shouldn't be there, which means that there's fraud involved, and then we can find the fraudster and we can put him in jail. But why do we have to persecute hundreds of farmers who've done nothing wrong? And why does all that food have to be destroyed? Sorry, I've already said what it said here, but basically we should use the regulations when there's something illegal and stop it. We should put the fraudsters to jail or give them big fines, but we should not persecute innocent people in the food industry, and we should not destroy the food. And of course, in cases with unintentional problems, again, we should use to find where the problem is, solve it by changing the guidelines, and not allow people to do it again. But there's no point in putting those huge costs on the food industry to recall products that are not safe, that are not unsafe. What we think in the Global Harmonization Initiative is happening at the moment is that these regulators who are making the regulations, they are strongly influenced by the politicians, which is correct because this is a job of the politicians. But the politicians are being influenced by lobbyists and activists and the press, but not very much by scientists. Our scientists are also advising other parts here, but there's not very much happening there. And so whether there's science involved or not is sort of random. What we would like to have is a situation where the scientists have a much stronger influence on how the regulations are being put together, and particularly that the politicians ask the regulators to use the scientific evidence rather than to ignore it. So we want to improve the food regulations and remove these absurd regulations by obtaining global scientific consensus and to convince those who need to know. So that's the global harmonization activity. I'll now show you a few slides about what we think is part of the problem when we're talking about the general public, including the journalists who are selling newspapers and other publications to the general public. You very often, particularly from reading newspapers, get the impression that the general public, or at least the journalists' view of the general public, because I personally think that the general public is more clever, it's just the journalists who don't think that people can think. But there seems to be an idea that if you've got something toxic, it doesn't matter what the dose is. You've got the same damage for a high dose as for a low dose. So you say, well, we don't want anything, which doesn't, I mean, it does make sense if it's a terrible infectious pathogen which will grow in your body if you have just one cell there, but it doesn't make any sense for chemical toxins where the dose really does matter. Then when you go to the next level, typically politicians and regulators, you've got a sort of slightly more sensible idea, well, okay, there is a relation between dose and damage, and they sort of tend to think it's a sort of linear, which means that, of course, a high dose is worse than a small dose, but also that a small dose will still do damage. And that's a very common perception. And that's also part of the zero tolerance idea. However, if you actually talk with people who know about these things, you see that the most toxicologists, or pretty much all of them, agree that there is a threshold of no concern, the no observed adverse effect level. So even though all food contains toxins, if the level is below a certain threshold, then it doesn't really do any harm. Of course, way we can do that is because humans, like insects, develop resistance to anything that's bad to us. We have the same mechanisms as the insects to become resistant to toxins. Our body, our liver can detoxify things and get rid of it. We have ways to avoid it. Of course, if we get too much, it's toxic, but if we get a level that our body can cope with, then it's not doing any harm. This is not news. It was known actually back in the 1500s by Paracelsus, who already said then the dosage makes it either poison or remedy. What we have are toxic doses, not toxic substances. Scientists are still debating the actual details of the shape down there. Do we have just fat, so no effect, or do we actually have benefits? The idea of hormesis is not the consensus among GH scientists. I should say whether people believe in hormesis or in the threshold effect, they still agree that there is a threshold, so it's not dangerous below that level. If you believe, and it sounds like religious because there's not scientific consensus about it, if you believe in the hormesis, then you say we actually have a benefit at the very low level. Just to show a few examples, here's some from my own own research, where you have the no effect there at the level of 1, and this is a compound from carrot. The concentrations, the concentrations which we find in human plasma is actually where we can also measure benefits. Similarly, if you look at something like DDT, it's well known that it can enhance cancer under certain circumstances. But if you look at low concentration, it actually reduces the growth of the cancer cells. Not that I say that DDT is a good thing, because it's bad for the environment, but in this particular case, how it works in our bodies, it actually shows clear hormesis. What we all agree on is that there are some compounds which are good for us at high dose, so it's good for us at intermediate doses, so we can be deficient if we got too little, but they're also toxic if we get too much. Like vitamin A, there's very little difference between what's good for us and what's harmful. The same thing with selenium. So there we can cope with these problems and still find ways of doing it in regulations. In the Global Harmonization Initiative, we have, for example, a working group which are working on developing new methods and teaching about it. So here's about some in vitro methods of measuring which compounds are actually dangerous at the low concentrations that might occur in humans. This is not yet in the current regulations, but we hope it will make it there. Various people write stories and information in these publications, including the New Food magazine, which you actually got a copy of. I'm not sure it's that copy, but just one of the places where you can read about us. If you want to be a member, you could go to the website. Notice there's a Z there, because it's global in the sense of being American in that context. It's not, you don't have to pay anything, you just need to show that you know what you're doing, and you can then influence the future. If this dose response is actually hormetic, if we have a benefit at low doses, then of course things becomes much easier, because then we don't need to know which doses are harmful. Those are the ones that should be avoided. We just need to know which doses are beneficial, because below that level we don't have any problems. The problem until now is that most tests of harm are not suitable for measuring benefits, and most tests that are suitable for measuring benefits are not routinely applied to toxins. So basically, we don't have any data of the appropriate tests in appropriate dose level. So what I challenge you, say, Well, there's no scientific reasons why we don't have those data. So please just go on with it, produce some data. Think about that the next time you make a toxicology experiment. Look for the benefits as well. And if you find lots of benefits at low doses, then we can change the world as we know it, because that's really going to make a big difference. So thank you very much, and sorry that I went a little bit over the time.